Okay.
Sorry, who is the person who's just joined? Your name doesn't come up. Who is that? Oh, Andrew. Welcome, Andrew. Very good. Thanks for joining us. How are you doing?
No problem. Not too bad. Hold on, sorry, I'm just muting and unmuting. Not too bad. Got a bit of a cold today, so I'm going to mute and just listen. And if I've got queries, I'll pop in every now and then, but I'll be on mute for most of the time, I think.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Right, so we're going to start. The session will be recorded and we'll then be able to distribute it to all members of the committee. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. This is the subcommittee of the professional body for digital practitioners, specifically concerning continuous professional development. And as you can see, hopefully from in front of you, there is an agenda, 5-point agenda, which has been established, and we can change it from as we go along. And we can certainly, please feel free to ask questions and to challenge any of the points. But what I want to do very quickly is I want to give a very quick review of what our professional designations are. I do hope you will have seen the one of the previous emails from Toka, which in fact copied the link to the YouTube video of our previous induction meetings that had taken place. I will ask Toka, nevertheless, to send that link out again so that you can actually just get a reinduction if you need to of what it is we're doing here at the professional body. So what we're doing today is we're talking about continuous professional development or lifelong learning. And the principle is really this. It is a principle that says that after the initial formation of the designation has taken place and the awarding of the professional designation has been made to the individual recipient, that individual who is now considered to be a professional practitioner, either as a professional digital technical practitioner or professional digital operator practitioner or a chartered digital professional practitioner, or finally as a master digital practitioner, and those are each categories within which multiple designations will eventually be located. But after an individual has obtained that designation through a designation center, either an internal designation center, which is within a company which has a critical mass of employees, or an external designation center, which ordinarily would be a training provider, where that training provider has access to a relatively large database of graduates, or a training provider which has a good imprint, a good access to companies which are its client base, which employ digital practitioners in these four category types. But the designation center will then have ensured that the professional body has designated the individual applicant. After that has happened, that individual then is required over a period of time, and we've established it as a standard, which is a 3-year period of time. There are some professional bodies that say a less lengthy period, such as 2 years. There are even some professional bodies that say annually. But as far as SAQA is concerned, the South African Qualifications Authority is concerned, it's not necessary to do anything other than the traditional 3-year expectation for re-registration in a professional designation category. And CPD, continuous professional development, is what happens between when the individual has been designated as a professional and then when they are required to re-register as a professional, to reapply for recognition as a professional. And in fact, that re-registration process is dependent on the individual attaining a certain number of points because they've participated in one or more of the elements on offer as continuous professional development. And it is for the designation center to continue to work with the professional body in determining all the various element categories that could be considered for continuous professional development, so that the individual can retain their professional recognition. So that's where we start with CPD. It's on the back of these professional designations which have been awarded to an individual, either in the technical category, in the operational category, in the professional category, or in the master category. The highest level of, if you want, occupational or operational mastery is as a professional. So it would be a chartered digital professional practitioner. But thereafter, at the master level, that is, for all intents and purposes, what one could refer to as the honorary level, conferring professional designation on an individual, which is outside of the ambit or the scope of operation, and has more to do with length of time in an entire sector of industries and amount of, or rather, scope of responsibilities. So continuous professional development then kicks in with the notion that for every one of these professional designations, the professional body, together with the designation centers in a particular area, need to ensure that there is enough lifelong learning which is attached or mapped to each of those professional designations so that the person keeps current, they are exposed to best practice, and they have an opportunity to ensure that when it comes to re-registration, that they've not rested on the laurels of 3 years ago, but they've been continuously involved and evolving in the sector of digital practice. So those are the designations. And now just going back to the agenda, moving off of the professional designations, we now want to just very briefly look at the role of the designation centers. And essentially, this is the role of those designation centers. It is to facilitate the continuous professional development participation of every designated practitioner within the geographical scope of the designation center. Now, it's not to give every CPD program or to offer the CPD programs, it's to facilitate it. Some of them will be offered through the designation center, where the designation center is able to be endorsed by the professional body for purposes of offering continuous professional development. But the majority of it will be in-house or public participation offered programs. And sometimes, and I need to say this, and I'll say this again when we talk about MOUs with other professional bodies, but sometimes even the recognition of continuous professional development activity as it takes place by providers who are endorsed by other professional bodies. So we want to be in a network or a confederation of professional bodies eventually, where we recognize what other professional bodies do for continuous professional development in the digital space and vice versa, where they recognize what we offer to their professional designees in the digital space. So that public participation is critical to, I suppose, from a weighting point of view, it is as important, if not more important, that public participation or public elements are offered for continuous professional development than in-house elements are offered for continuous professional development. And when I talk about public, I'm also talking about international offering for continuous professional development. Practical example, Harvard University's open course on continuous professional development could be regarded as warranting to be endorsed by the professional body and to earn continuous professional development points for any designee of the professional body who participates in that particular course by Harvard. But similarly, a platform-based program, either product knowledge or exposure from a platform provider into the digital sector could equally, so Microsoft, for example, or Apple, for example, or even Amazon, for example, might very well be recognized for continuous professional development. But basically what we're saying is that we want the designation centers to be on top of facilitating that all of the elements that are recognized and endorsed within and by the professional body are in fact on offer to all of the recipients of the professional designations, so that we're able to continuously, and I'm going to use a word that is an ugly word, but I'm going to try and use it neutrally, but that we're able to chase the people who've originally received professional designations from our professional body, to chase them so that they're participating annually in as many of the elements which are on offer to them, either physically in their province or online, or in some form or another. And a little later, we're going to be unpacking the various categories of continuous professional development. But so that the designation centers are able to chase those individuals, the management information system that we've developed is one that will allow us to red flag individual designees who are not participating in continuous professional development, and at some stage also to red flag to their supervisors who are identified on our management information system that those individuals run the risk of losing their professional recognition from the professional body if they do not participate and if they do not catch up in participating in continuous professional development. One of the things we are hard at work in doing, and I'm going to say that we're going to be piloting this with two particular companies, the King George company on the one hand, and on the other hand, VML. But one of the things we want to have mastered, certainly by the end of this year, if not before, is the opportunity to link continuous professional development participation, both in-house within the company, as well as externally, either by, for example, the IAB South Africa or the designation centers or other training providers, but to link all of that through to the performance management system used in those companies. So when performance reviews are taking place, a report from the designation center will initiate a discussion between a manager and a subordinate on whether or not they're participating in continuous professional development, whether it's at an acceptable level, and even at a later stage, we'll be able to say in terms of an interactive CPD activity, which is also assessed in terms of how they're doing on those CPD activities. In other words, that they're mastering knowledge and possibly practice about best practices around the world when it comes to digital activities that the practitioners would be expected to master at their respective professional designation levels. These technical, operational, professional, and master levels that we've established within the taxonomy of the professional body. Before I carry on, are there any questions that any points that anyone wants to raise? To ask or to make a statement, just unmute your microphone. Yes, Ariel.
Yeah, no, I'm just because I'm just trying to understand then who. So is the main role of the committees then to certify those in-house training, or basically, or which element of public participation is considered sufficient? I mean, how is that basically managed? Because that's really the crux of it, I presume. The rest of it, if so, who certify? So how do you certify those in-house training, or those? What public participation courses are required for each designation?
So thanks for that question. I mean, that's a critical question. So the role of the subcommittee is to look at the policy, and we will be, what's the word I'm looking for? We'll be distributing the draft policy for CPD to you, to look at the policy and say, yeah, it's great, we think it can work, or maybe we should tweak it here and there. Normally, the tweaks will come in on the substantive issues, like, for example, how long it should take for a course to be endorsed by the professional body, or how long the points will last for. There are some professional bodies that say, your points, if you let's say there are three touch points or 3 workshops in a series, and you get points from the first 2 workshops, but you don't complete the 3rd workshop, how long the first 2 workshop CPD points will last. Obviously, the system that we're wanting to set up is one that chases an individual to complete whatever they start. So that's a substantive element. So the first port of call will be for the members of this subcommittee to look at the policy and say, fine, we can go with the policy, we're happy with the policy. The second port of call will be then to look at the moderators who are nominated to work with the professional body in the endorsement process. So a training provider or a company invariably will have an internal moderator who will be accountable to the professional body because of strategic advantage or the perception of strategic advantage, whereas an external course training provider will submit to the professional body a course or a program or an element, might even just be a thought leadership journal or magazine, but an element for endorsement by the professional body, so that the professional body through the designation centers can then be recommending that professional continuous professional development element to the recipients for whom it's targeted. And so that endorsement process will be will be managed by the rules that this subcommittee will eventually agree to. And we're not talking about, reams and reams of rules. We're simply talking about one page of 10 criteria, for example, and with you being comfortable with how we will then measure those criteria and account for those criteria and what will constitute endorsement. So in answer to your question, Ariel, the subcommittee won't be responsible for the endorsement either of a CPD provider or of the element that the CPD provider wants to offer, but will be responsible for the policy and the procedural framework. And then the professional body will be accountable to the subcommittee for the number of providers of CPD that have been endorsed, for the number of learning programs or elements which have been recognized on an ongoing basis. And then your job is just to make sure that you're always comfortable with the fact that for every designation, we've got a critical mass of CPD that will run over a 3-year period for each of those designees, because that is what we will then take back as a calendar of CPD on an annual basis to all of the people who've been designated in the various professional categories. But there is a third area where we want to use this subcommittee, and that's for the area of appeal. And so you have to have an appeals process in place. But for example, if a provider applies to be a CPD provider, and either because as a provider there is a hole in their narrative, or because one of their elements that they want to offer is not acceptable, they then get rejected by the professional body. They're entitled to appeal, and we would want to constitute that appeal committee from this particular subcommittee, from the CPD subcommittee of the professional body for digital practice. I hope that then answers your question, Ariel.
Sort of. So effectively, so there's going to be another body, if I understand it, with some people which are going to then determine what are the courses which are required, or what is the content, effectively. So is that, if I understand it correctly? Is that a designation center? So it's just find it a bit theoretical. So
the endorsement is directly from the professional body itself. You see, for a professional body to be registered with the South African Qualifications Authority, we have to gather, let's just call them subject matter experts. They could either be assessors, or they could be moderators, conciliators, or arbitrators. And we will use that people that we gather from the individual, from the sector of industries that make up the digital sector, as we've defined it. And we'll use that body of people who will, on a discrete basis, case-by-case basis, be assessing and then recommending the endorsement or non-endorsement of the training providers, the higher level individuals. So it would be assessors that do that work, and then it would be the moderators who check on the work that are done by the assessors on a one-to-one basis. So when a trainer,
so the subcommittee appoints those people effectively, or some gives them
people. But now that you've brought it up, it would be very useful to have the subcommittee as an oversight of the listing. Let's call it the listing and the registration of these individuals. Good. Thank you, Ariel. Thanks for the question. All right. So moving on. So the re-registration, as things stand at this moment in time, we've established that the designation will last for 3 years. So you will be able to call yourself a chartered professional digital practitioner, whatever it is, for a 3-year period. We will be marketing to the world at large, including your employers, that you have that professional status. We will be, if you want, glorifying the professional status and the recipients of the professional status on both an above and below the line basis as much as we can, as well as with the recruitment industry. And within that 3-year period, we require you to participate in a sufficient continuous professional development, where we would say, for argument's sake, over a 3-year period, 120 points need to be earned, or 12 points need to be earned, depending on whether or not we give 1 point for an activity or 10 points for an activity. Tradition has it that you give 1 point for an activity, 2 points if that same activity is assessed. So 1 point for attendance, the second point for participating in an assessment, so that we allow as varied and as wide a CPD scope as possible, where if it's just product knowledge or process knowledge that is being trained, then that's attendance. If it's mastery, in other words, there's some form of an assessment, and that assessment can be moderated, the individual might get the second point. I think one of the debates we're going to get into once we start operating for continuous professional development purposes is whether or not and I'm not sure, I've forgotten the term, but the visual of it being 1 point as opposed to 10 points is more impactful with the industry. But really, it's just that's marketing and that's packaging more than anything else. The tradition is that professional bodies generally that offer CPD or promote CPD will work with the 1 or 2 point, the binary option. 1 being attendance, 2 being attendance and assessment. There are intervening opportunities as well, for example, in things that can't be assessed but require a certain amount of time and a certain amount of commitment beyond just a once-off activity like participating on a committee or participating in a position of leadership, where you would automatically award the 2 points on offer. When it comes to something like a conference, for example, the IAB conference, where there are multiple sessions, it's an opportunity to then endorse the entire conference for, let's say the requirement for argument's sake is 12 points a year, but to endorse a conference for 6 of those 12 points, because the individual has an opportunity to participate in 6 discrete elements which are recognized by the professional body during that 1 or 2 days of that conference that the IAB might manage, or might offer. There's that kind of flexibility, which very definitely will be and needs to be built into the system. And so ultimately we'll say then that if an individual has not participated in a minimum of 60 to 80% of what's required of them from a CPD perspective, it's very seldom you're able to enforce 100% across the board. But if they've not participated in between 60 and 80% of CPD requirements over a 3-year period, then they would not be eligible for re-registration of their professional designation, and therefore they would have to apply from scratch to be professionally designated. Good. Moving on. So I just want to get to CPD in particular and address some of these points. So CPD will take place, continuous professional development will take place by way of an endorsement process, which is an application by an organization to be a CPD provider, and then by that organization to offer 1 or more elements in the range of elements which is eventually recognized by the professional body for CPD purposes. And it is in that endorsement process that the assessors and the moderators, and from an overview perspective, this subcommittee will then look at how we're building that CPD calendar and ask the question, is it robust enough? Is there enough content? Is there enough international participation in the CPD program? I will be asking you at some stage to, and certainly not for the first year, but from the second year, I will be asking you to debate and to agree on the ideal percentage of international inclusion, where, for example, the professional body together with the designation centers would need to hunt down and seek out the global subject matter experts that we could bring in via webinar, via online training, and potentially even via face-to-face conferencing. But we will be asked as a subcommittee to eventually decide on what percentage of a CPD calendar we want to be globally driven in terms of best practices and in terms of global mastery. It's quite difficult to do in the realm of digital practice. And that's only because there are so many providers and so many discrete platforms and systems out there, and none of them participate in, if you want, a funnel such as a professional body in a country as the one we're creating. So over time, it will become the way we do business. And certainly the companies that offer internal training, which is globally linked, it's a lot easier for those companies to get off the ground with that particular requirement than it would be on a public basis. But it is certainly something that we would chase from the beginning to try and ensure is in place over a period of time. Certainly what we want to do is say that by the time we get to the re-registration of the pilots, which begin this year, in other words, by 2022, by the time we get to the end of 2022, we want to have established some kind of a global percentage of the content we're offering, even if it's only 10 or 15%. The average in the group of professional bodies in operation, including statutory bodies, the average percentage of global participation is between 20 and 30%. I would imagine we'd want to start off between 10 and 15%, and over a 3-year period look to grow it to up to a maximum of about 30% of content. And that then sends a message to the organizations that organize the conferences, such as, for example, the IAB, that over time we would like you to ensure that 30% of what you have on offering, if not more, is global content offered either via webinar or by people coming to the country to offer the workshops, because then at least we're able to say we're not looking to become a player as a professional body in offering that CPD, but that it's being offered by the organizations within the network of the professional body. And that's ideally how we want to structure and continue to structure the professional body. The professional body should not be a for-profit organization. It's not looking to derive income for the professional body. We want to ensure that income is derived for the partners within the network of the professional body, either the designation centers or the training providers, or even the companies that offer in-house training. From a PBDP point of view, just to emphasize that everything we're talking about in terms of CPD elements, because it's not accredited material and not accredited elements, at this moment in time, you're able to spend 15% of the 6% of payroll you have to spend on skills development for PBDP purposes. The regulation that came out for comment by May last year increased that to 25% of what you have to spend on skills development. And the YES regulations, which have been published, say that if you are a youth employment service company, a YES company, then besides being able to skip PBDP levels, you will be able to spend up to 50% of your budget, skills development budget, on, let's call it non-accredited work, but work which is designed to enhance a person in their particular job that they're employed in. Any questions about that before I actually go into some thoughts on the various categories of elements?
Yeah, I've got a couple, unless other people want to ask first.
Well, Ariel, I think kick off and let's see where we get.
Okay, two, but one of them, just in terms of our field, actually 3 questions, which is very international. I mean, it's 15%, sounds rather low from point of view that there's a lot of stuff available around the world already. So I can imagine someone basically feeling almost 100% with material which is available globally. So I'm just wondering why even put such a cap on the international,
Thanks,
especially on a field which is very digital. That's one, yeah.
So the answer to you is we're not capping it. We're simply talking about a floor. So we're saying we're saying that we at least have 15% international content, but the more international, the more global our content can be, the better. Now, there might sometimes be an argument that, for example, for a homegrown platform, for a, I don't know, let's say in the public sector, the public service, there's a justification for not having international content, although it's hard for me to imagine what that could be. But we're really just talking about a floor here, not a cap of international content.
The other one, I'm just curious to see what, because I'm not familiar, what are they doing in for example, in other non-digital side, like let's say above the line, or like let's say media planners, whatever. Do they have their own professional qualification parallel to this thing, or is this going to be in a digital going on by itself? So, do they have this in advertising? Do they have a digital?
So when I come to MOUs, the next topic, which is the memorandums of understanding and agreement between various professional bodies, I will talk a lot there about the opportunity to share digital components and to have designations within designations and CPD recognized across the various professional bodies. There's no
Okay.
about the fact that the vast majority of professional bodies are all dabbling in the digital components of other people's jobs. So, for example, even in a legal professional body, the notion that the vast majority of references and precedents are now online, the notion that thought leadership is now all online, and there's very little that is still in printed form. So, whatever the job is, there's a digital component to it. We are talking about those industries where at least 80 to 90% of the job component and content is digital. That's how we're distinguishing ourselves, and we are distinguishing ourselves specifically in the advertising sector, in the publishing sector, although by agreement with the Publishing Council, in the consulting, internal consulting and external consulting fields around digital, and in the training fields around digital as well. So that's how we're defining this sector very narrowly initially, because obviously there's a digital component of all sectors, just as there's bookkeeping and accounting and human resources. So even though there are professional bodies for each, they really are multi-sectoral and multi-industry, cross-sectoral and cross-industry. And it's through those MOUs, that network, that framework of MOUs, that I think this kind of thing will eventually take care of itself.
And is there something like that for advertising at the moment? For not digital, but just in advertising?
No, there isn't.
In South Africa,
there isn't. So
there isn't at the moment anyone like classified creative directors or the media planners or traditional media planners. They're not part of any professional organization.
So it is within the taxonomy of the Publishing Council to do that. They haven't yet done it. It's also within the taxonomy of MASA, which is the marketing professional body, and they've also not done it. And it's also within the province of the public relations, believe it or not. So it's public relations, it's MASA. There are a number. And in fact, as we grow in terms of the impact and the penetration of this term digital, and as the Department of Trade and Industry establish more and more SIC codes, which are standard industrial classification codes, which will include digital. At the moment they don't, but the international SIC codes do. As that happens, so you'll find more and more the other professional bodies wanting to define what digital means in their sector. What we'll do and what we will continue to do is look to enter into MOUs with those professional bodies to share the creative elements of the digital practitioners and to own the creative elements of the digital practitioners.
Okay, and one more question. Sorry, I don't want to, last one in terms of your mention about the non-certified, that they're not certified in terms of Adobe, but also in terms of the CETAs. Is it going to be part of the preview of this subcommittee to actually create a standard that is actually, because at the moment there isn't. There's one for normal advertising, but a lot of it is irrelevant. Is there going to be one about actually creating unit standards or effectively qualification standard within that CETA recognized?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. Let me go back to one of the previous presentations that we will copy you with. But you'll see from those presentations that we say, where we start with the individual is we say, do you have a qualification in digital, which is either endorsed by the professional body or that you can bring to us that we can recognize? Has that qualification been mapped against a job that we recognize in the digital sector? And then has that job been mapped to our professional designation framework? So we're not establishing the standards for the qualifications, but we're saying, show us qualifications that are on offer and how those qualifications map to our designations. Now, if it turns out, and I think you're right in the respect that very little has been done, but if it turns out that there is a need for the development and for the accreditation, and we don't accredit qualifications, for the development and the accreditation of the qualifications, then we will work with the Qualification Council for Trade and Occupation, which is one of the qualification councils reporting to the South African Qualifications Authority. We will work with the QCTO to establish that qualification as it applies across all training providers that want to offer qualifications into the digital sector. Let's call it the creative digital sector, our digital sector, with the QCTO. But we're, as a professional body, we're not accountable for those qualifications. We're accountable to say, if you've got a qualification or if you've been RPL, is recognized as being competent against the qualification, even if you haven't got it, we're ready to admit you to be considered for a professional designation, for professional recognition.
Yeah.
We're also
Okay, but
we're also
okay.
entitled to say it's a prerequisite. We insist that you have to have that qualification if there was one in the marketplace before you, and X amount of experience before you can apply to us for professional recognition.
Okay, because I thought it was part of the preview of this, but maybe I was wrong, because I think it's absolutely essential for it to be, because I know from trying to map it across a big, in terms of like, for when you're trying to develop things which are certified, especially from the BE point of view, you have to map, and at the moment there's nothing one can map it to. There's advertising, but that is so much irrelevant content that actually becomes, especially from a practical problem, it is an issue that if you want to develop, especially if you're saying that you want to a component is in-house training or whatever, it does definitely help if there is if there are standards to which you can basically map towards. So I'm not quite sure how this body can do that or what, but I think it is definitely something which will be very highly useful for most companies.
Yes, I think you're absolutely correct. And in our designation subcommittee, where we're putting these designations together, the purpose of the designation subcommittee is to certainly focus on how we map qualifications or how we identify missing qualifications which should be there but are not there in terms of the National Qualification Framework or in terms of the occupational framework that falls under the South African Qualifications Authority, so that we can initiate those discussions and qualifications. But I think something you said that's critically important, and maybe we can look to do this through the IAB to its membership. I think that what's missing is pointing out to companies how all of their internal training, all of the stuff they're currently spending money on, but for which they can't get recognition because it's not NQF accredited, how 15% of their expenditure that they're supposed to be spending could actually be counted that they spend on those short courses and internal training already. Let's call it the CPD panoply of elements. And how eventually, if they become a yes company, that could be increased to 50% of their skills development expenditure, which has to be recognized by verification agencies. It might be very useful for us to consider actually through the IAB running an online webinar specifically about that and how to physically and practically do it, so that companies understand the benefit of taking what they do in an informal way and actually quantifying it so that it can be set off at least against 15% of their skills budget, maybe even more into the future. So thanks for that question, Ariel.
Okay. So is that something that we're going to be doing through this, or you said it's a different subcommittee?
Well,
it
would be the designation subcommittee. It's the subcommittee that looks at the jobs, looks at the qualifications that are already on offer, identifies where there are not qualifications on offer, deals then with the SAQA quality councils, such as the QCTO, which is primarily where we would look to locate the relationship, and say to the QCTO, please, we need you to expedite the development of these generic qualifications in digital, because we want to be able to recognize them towards our professional designations.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Ariel. Thank you for that. Any other questions before I move on? Andrew, are you still with us? All right.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, I'm still here.
Excellent. Thanks, man. Chirp in anytime you want to. Hey? All right. So moving on, guys. If you want the categories of elements that fall under continuous professional development are unending. You can have basically any online content or physical content or responsibilities recognized for continuous professional development, as long as they can be mapped against the outcomes or the requirements of jobs, and ultimately be mapped against the, let's call them the responsibilities identified in the professional designations themselves. But these are the typical elements to be looking at. So short courses, be they in-house or public short courses. Thought leadership, articles, where one would either read articles and have some kind of an interactive assessment that would tell us you've read and absorbed the content of the article, or where you would write the thought leadership article, and therefore you would be considered to be a thought leader in the sector as well. So the higher up, the more responsible or accountable the professional designation. So I would imagine, certainly for some operators, but certainly for the chartered digital professional practitioners and the master digital practitioners, we would look to elicit a large proportion of articles that get written that could be published either in industry-specific magazines or in globally recognized magazines, whatever the case is. But so that would then count towards that element then of thought leadership, be they articles which are either read or articles which are written. So it's short courses, it's thought leadership, it's face-to-face interactions, which could be training interactions, it's events such as workshops, seminars, and conferences, it's webinars, which could be considered to be local or international, it's one-on-one activity such as coaching, such as mentoring, such as performance management. And we can break performance management down further, where we can talk about recognizing when a team leader or a supervisor or a first-line manager manages or counsels or disciplines, when they're involved in conciliating activity, arbitrating activity, or chairing activity. That all is counted as continuous professional development as long as it can be accounted and quantified for on the system that we've created to capture CPD participation, essentially where the result of it can be uploaded into the vault of the individual who has been professionally designated by the professional body. And then in terms of non-core personal participation, when we say non-core, we're saying for the company, but it's core for the industry and for the sector, such as, for example, participating in industry bodies or committees, being a subject matter expert on various committees and industry bodies, or in positions of leadership on those industry or sectoral bodies. And then finally, the notion of participating in quality assurance is critically important when it comes to continuous professional development. And here what we're saying is, how are we going to quality assure CPD from the company or the training provider? In other words, what we call institutional CPD quality assurance. So if, for example, a company wants to be endorsed by the professional body as a training provider, how are we going to quality assure them? Is it going to be once a year? Is it going to be only every 3 years because it's CPD? Are we going to quality assure the events themselves? And are we going to look to quality assure or at least be accountable for the results of those events as well? So it's a critically important consideration as we move into building our CPD model. So while the elements of CPD are, quite frankly, non-exhaustive, these are the ones we'll initially start focusing on: short courses, thought leadership, events, webinars, one-on-one activities, and non-core personal participation. As we grow, we know we'll have more and more varied elements that we would want to account for, but at least initially, I think that gives us more than enough to play with, and I hope everybody agrees with that. Good. Moving on.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Can I just quickly? Sorry. So, and all those are basically most of them would be just personal declarations, I take it. Let's say if you did a course, or is it about, let's say you're talking about doing a public course?
So what?
It's about is it about declaration that you did it rather than actually having to provide a certificate?
So let's say, for example, Microsoft want to run a course in mastering coding or one of their platforms for digital.
Okay.
We're saying that Microsoft would need to bring that course to the professional body for endorsement. The course would be assessed and then moderated. Microsoft as a provider would be assessed and moderated first, and then their course would be assessed and moderated. So we're actually able for that 3-year period to recommend Microsoft as a training provider and the course for that digital platform let's call it best practices course, whatever it is, to endorse that so that we're actually then able to recommend it to everybody who's been professionally recognized by the professional body, who's been designated by the professional body. Because what SACWA says is that if a professional body either markets or recognizes a course without endorsing it for CPD purposes, and doesn't quality assure either going in terms of the work that's required before you recommend it, or in fact by quality assuring along the way, then that is for all intents and purposes considered to be a fraudulent activity, because essentially any Tom, Dick or Harry could come along, just literally list their course without having to go through any rigorous process of quality assurance, offer the course, and the professional body would have to stand behind it. So SACWA is saying you can't have it.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Hello? Yeah, so because no, my concern, I'm just trying to understand. So effectively, so these are not courses like you online. And let's say that you've, because I've been to other professional bodies before in finance, whatever, that everything is based on self-declarations. But in this case, but I'm just trying to understand, so what is effectively, if we are going to put all those stuff and things that you can do, especially from public things or things that you actually go, what is the cost burden on an individual in order to maintain? Is it something that we're calculating in terms of, because it's one thing, for example, to me to go to, let's say there's a Coursera course or something that I'm just auditing, and then it is maybe accredited, okay, the course is relevant, and then the person just listens to it but doesn't register? Or are we got the expectation that we'll have people who have to register and in order to get a certificate at the end of it? So therefore it implies, if we do it that way, there's certain cost implication, and what is the cost burden that we are calculating is it going to be to maintain the qualification?
Okay, thank you for that question. So let me start by saying this. There will be an initial cost that the training provider that wants to offer the CPD element will have to pay. And that cost is simply a cost which covers the cost of the assessor and the moderator's activity in looking at the course or in looking at the training provider. If the training provider is already accredited, then there's virtually no cost to the endorsement of the provider, but there'll obviously be a cost to the endorsement of the CPD element of it. As far as the individual is concerned, a professional body is not allowed to establish the costs of continuous professional development. That is for the training provider to establish for themselves, or rather the CPD provider to establish for themselves, and market forces must dictate. What we don't want to do is land in a problem with the Competition Commission, a problem of collusion here. So that the professional body will not dictate the costs of the courses, the costs of the elements, etc. The free market must, in fact, determine whether or not that's acceptable. If, however, the professional body is of an opinion, and believe it or not, but that will be a decision of this subcommittee. Let's say we determine that, and for example, in the marketing industry, a normal CPD program in the marketing industry on average costs 3,500 Rand for a half-day workshop. And if we determine that that is ridiculous, it is prohibitory, and we want to do something about it, then we are entitled to try and engage in some form of determining a floor, or rather a ceiling in this instance, for what we'd like to suggest to endorsed providers that they look to charge, or alternatively, to ask for the market, to say to the market, this is 3,500 Rand a day for, let's say, a 3-hour contact session. We don't think that that's ethically where we want to see the costs of CPD pegged. And so we would actively try and activate other providers to try and put solutions together that get to the same place, but at a cheaper rate. But we've got to be very, very careful about not interfering to the extent that it becomes collusion or prefers one provider over another provider. As a professional body, I'm
totally like, I'm totally in agreement. I didn't put it from the angle of actually colluding or agreeing. I'm just thinking from our point of view, I think it's going to be a really cognizant, whatever market is going to provide, and it's fairly easy to establish, in terms of in the market of what people charging for courses, but in terms of the requirement to make on an individual, in terms of you need to, let's say, achieve 10 points, and we know to achieve the 10 points versus achieving maybe 5 points of courses, we need to have a sense of what is the burden for individual in terms of, because that will depend in terms of also in terms of the uptake of the qualification, because just in terms of if we say 10 different elements and it costs you 10,000 a year to keep up to date versus we can require less in terms of accreditation that only requires roughly maybe on 2,000, it makes a difference. I'm just trying to understand what is the framework have we thought about that in terms of what are the what is yeah.
I love the idea that you've already raised it. So our job is to make sure that re-registration, because the person is participating in CPD, is not prohibitory in terms of what it's going to cost them. So if we determine that the market forces are pushing the cost of CPD way beyond the average person who's been designated by the professional body, then we have to become active. And to do that, we will seek SACWA's participation with us in becoming active, in either creating additional elements which are less costly, or in promoting other providers in some form or another. So we have to take an active role. And you're completely correct. We want to make sure that as many people as possible, number one, can be designated by us. And number two, once designated, that they can re-register their designation, because it's cost effective for them to participate in continuous professional development. And that's an ongoing focus, not just of this subcommittee, but driven by this subcommittee. It's an ongoing focus of the professional body itself.
Okay. No, thank you.
But thank you for that. I mean, this is the first time we've ever actually grappled in a question and answer session with that issue. So thank you for coming to the party. It's absolutely critical. Really appreciate that. All right. So now I just want to talk about relationships, because I'm very aware of the fact that we said to you from the beginning, we don't want these sessions to be longer than an hour at a time. We might just go over an hour today. So external relationships become very, very important in the work of the CPD committee and the professional body, in the sense that we want digital to be recognized as something which has massive overlap with all of the designations in all of the other professional bodies. It's impossible to conceive of a professional designation that wouldn't have a digital element to it. So what we want over time is for the other professional bodies, and there are about 100 of them, and that's excluding the statutory bodies, to recognize that there's no harm to them in accepting the PDP's role, the digital practitioner professional body's role in number one, designating digital practitioners in their member companies where those individuals spend 80% of their time on digital work. And that's not the focus of an engineering professional body or a medical professional body or whatever it is. So that's the first purpose of wanting relationships and memorandums of understanding and agreement. And the second purpose is to look at saying, when we have a CPD session that's running in digital, we would like your professionals, your designated professionals, to be allowed to attend our CPD activities, which are organized as events, either online or in face-to-face sessions by the designation centers. We'd like you to give 1 or 2 points of recognition to your professionals participating in our CPD activity. So a practical example outside of digital is what happens between the professional body for psychologists and the professional body for lawyers. If a lawyer who has to achieve their CPD points attends one of the CPD elements on offer from the professional body for psychology, his professional body, which is the law professional body, will recognize that for CPD purposes and say you've amassed 1 or 2 CPD points towards the 12 you need to get within the legal professional body every year, and vice versa. It happens with bookkeepers, it happens with accountants. We want it to happen with digital practice as well, because that does 2 things. It elevates the recognition of digital practice to a professional standard, number one. And the second thing it does is it creates an economy of scale market for the training providers within the digital space offering those CPD activities. Any points or any questions in that regard? Okay, good. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is basically an induction into what the CPD committee will be doing. There are 12 people, I think, that are on our CPD committee. So it is those 12 people who now we're going to ask just to listen to this induction. And so that we want to create an opportunity for a follow-up date within a month, before which time we want you to see the draft proposals of the policy to do with our CPD framework. It's actually 6 weeks, not a month's time. But we're going to want you to see the draft proposal on our CPD framework. We're going to want you to email us with your questions, with your suggestions, etc., so that we can then get it out timeously within 6 weeks for the follow-up meeting of the CPD subcommittee, and so that we can also hopefully by then begin mapping, and we'll just take one designation to map it against a proposed CPD framework to give an example of how the machine would work and how we would want the designation centers to be taking that CPD framework to market in terms of applying it to the people who will eventually get the designations, the professional designations on offer from the professional body. The CPD calendar and activities will only kick off, I would imagine, at the earliest by about August, which is when we anticipate the pilots for the designations to have been completed and the first group of recipients to be in receipt of their designations. That CPD framework will then begin to apply to them after August, let's say 1st of September, for a 3-year period. So we know then that the clock will start kicking on what we require from them to participate in CPD on the 1st of September 2019, 20, 21, 22, so that by the end of August 2023, we will look at re-registration of those individuals in their professional categories and the next round of CPD. I think one of the things we didn't discuss today and will become an issue, not an issue, but will become a feature of further discussions down the line, is how we're able to take one CPD event or element and apply it to more than one designation. So practical example could be the law on verification of digital content, just as an example. Now, if there was to be a CPD program on the legal aspects of verification for digital content, it would very definitely apply to the technical, operational, professional, and the master level. And so we would end up with the opportunity for a CPD element to be presented where it covers the entire framework of designation and not just one designation. It might be that at different levels, different points are in fact awarded for either attendance or for assessment for the same module or the same content that is presented on that one occasion. But the opportunity then to apply one CPD element across our designations so we've got maximum articulation, I think is critically important. And down the line, and we always saying, after the first year of operation of our CPD calendars, we will have a different discussion. And that discussion is how a designee, a person who's got a designation, let's say as a technician, can actually jump to the operator level of designation by participating in the right combination of CPD elements. In other words, how they come in with an initial qualification, but then are able to use CPD to jump levels of CPD, of designation, of professional body designation. That becomes very, very interesting. And then finally, how we build RPL into a framework like that, recognition of prior learning into a framework like that. When you consider at the moment that in excess of 85% of people who work in the digital space do not have qualifications in the digital space, but either have short courses or self-mastery, those individuals need to be RPL'd and measured against the professional designation framework in such a way that they can be called a professional just as someone coming out of university, but with not the same length of experience, might be able to refer to themselves. So that's how we're going to extend the scope and the ambit of this CPD committee to move into meaningful management and ownership of the problem of lifelong learning in the digital space in South Africa. Any final points before I end off on the session? And I do apologize, we've gone 6 minutes over time. Any final points?
No, just a quick one in terms of these pilot programs, because I haven't heard of them. How is it possible to participate, for companies to participate in the pilots?
Well, we are always looking for companies to volunteer themselves so that we could run the pilots for the staff in those companies. So, Ariel, it's as easy as an email between you and myself to begin the facilitation process.
Sure.
Good.
Okay.
All right. If there are no
Thanks.
further comments, I just want to thank all of you for participating. And I think, and I hope, ladies and gentlemen, that you're as enthused as I am. This project has been long in the coming. It's over close to 3 years now in the making. There is a limited amount of participation only because of the nature and the culture of the industry and the sector, but we are forging ahead, and we certainly want to be, by the end of the year, we want to be able to say this. We have a framework in place that's accepted. We have a policy framework in place that's been worked on and accepted for everything we do in the professional body. We have a number of pilots in a number of provinces around the country that have been piloted within companies and within training provider graduate basis that have been accepted. And we have a CPD calendar that's been initiated. And importantly, we have a certain number of agreements with other professional bodies for cross-recognition, if you want, of CPD activity. I think that will make it have been a valuable year, 2019 having been a valuable year, so we're able to mainstream then into 2020, knowing everything's in place. And I hope and I trust you will agree with that strategy. So thank you all for attending and for participating, and thank you for agreeing to participate on this subcommittee.
Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Bye-bye. Ron, I see there's something you want to say quickly.
Thanks, Ivan. Bye-bye.
Okay. Excellent. Well, guys, thank you, everybody, for participating, and I look forward to us working together.